Hello everyone, so today I'll be talking about the pros and cons of Apple macOS, Microsoft Windows, and Linux. So basically these three operating systems right here. So each one has its pros and they all have their cons as well. And none of them are really perfect in everything, so let's go into it. So first I'll be covering Apple macOS. And Apple has always made their operating system or platform very easy to use, and this has been true back in the 1980s when they came out with their Apple II based computer. I had an Apple IIc and an Apple IIe back in the mid 1980s, and they were very easy to use. All you really had to do was stick in the program, which was in a floppy disk format, into the floppy disk drive and turn it on, and that's all you had to do to use the computer. You didn't have to know any commands or anything like that. And Macintosh was also very easy to use. And Mac OS today is also very easy to use. It's easier to use than Microsoft Windows 10. It's easier to use in Linux. Basically, it's very intuitive and a very stable operating system. And the reason why it's stable is because since it is a closed platform, Apple Corporation could pick the hardware that they want. They don't have to have a myriad of different drivers for different devices and components. They could just pick a few. They could maximize the performance for the hardware that they're using, and that's why Mac OS doesn't require a lot of hardware. Doesn't require a lot more memory to run, so it runs very efficiently, in other words. And Mac OS uses a Unix operating system kernel, so Unix was used back in the 1980s in business computers and mainframes and stuff like that. So it wasn't really an operating system used for the home environment. It was used mostly for business and stuff like that. And it's a pretty good operating system, but you needed to know commands to use it and everything. But so Mac OS is based on the Unix operating system, and they turned it into a GUI format, or a graphical user interface, and it's pretty stable, and it's very efficient as well. You don't need a lot of resources to get it to run good. Yeah, so it's very stable. It doesn't require a lot of RAM, and Apple designed their computers based on that. So people always brag about Apple not putting in good hardware and stuff like that, and a lot of RAM, but really, if you just want to use a computer, you really don't need that. If you're just a regular user who doesn't care about any of that stuff, it's fine. Just like for me, I really don't care about the horsepower of the car and all that stuff. I just want a automobile that gets me from point A to point B, and I really don't care about the specs of anything. I don't have to have a 500 horsepower engine. It just has to be reliable and get me from point A to B, and that's it. So Apple users are kind of like that in the computer world, so there isn't anything wrong with it. And Apple macOS has very good user it provides a very good user experience. So basically, the cons of it is that the software library is quite limited. It's not as vast as Microsoft Windows, and that's the only gripe that I have with macOS. But it has been getting better over the years, but it's still a lot less than Microsoft Windows, and it's always been like that for the past 30 odd years. Okay, and when you get an Apple computer, they aren't very upgradable either, so that's a problem with it. They aren't designed to be upgradable. So Apple Corporation's sources the parts. They incorporate all the drivers into their operating system, so everything runs smoothly, and that's how it's all put together, basically. So they aren't meant to be upgradable. It's just a closed platform, and that's just the way it is, you know. And there's no problem with that, obviously. But if you want to do like more stuff with your computer, like customize it and stuff like that, this is not the computer for you, or operating or platform for you. That'd be more like Microsoft Windows. So Microsoft Windows has been used, I think first version of Windows came out as Windows 3.0 back in 1990, I think. But the basis of the operating system that we use today, like Windows 10, is very closely resembles something like Windows 95, which was released around 1995. And it really hasn't changed very much in terms of the way that it looks for the past 26 years. So the pros of Windows operating system is that they have the largest library of software, and if you want to play the latest games and run the latest software, you're going to be able to find it on this platform, or the Microsoft Windows platform. And the driver support for just about any device for Microsoft Windows is very good. I mean, you could buy a scanner from anywhere, and they will have a driver for Microsoft Windows 10. And you should be able to just install it with the software that it comes with, and it should just work right out of the box. It's just plug and play. So if you get a printer, it's the same thing. If you get anything else, it's the same thing. Any other device, right? So yeah, this is good in that way. It has a large library of software. A lot of devices are supported on this thing, on this platform, which is good, obviously, because sometimes you just want a computer that just works, you know. You don't want to fiddle around with settings and everything to get simple stuff to work. So that's good in that way. And it's fairly easy to use. Windows 10 is, and Microsoft products in general, they're easy to use. And but Mac OS is easier to use. It's more, I guess, intuitive, but Windows 10 is also easy to use, but Mac OS is easier to use. So, and there's familiarity in that it hasn't really changed very much in the way that everything's set up. So you could still find control panel like you did back in 1995 with Windows 95. And if you go back in time, so let's say I have Windows 10. If I go back to Windows 8.1, it looks similar. And Windows 8 looks similar to Windows 10. And Windows 7 looks similar to Windows XP. And Windows XP looks similar to Windows Vista. And Windows XP looks similar to Windows 2000, and Windows 2000 looks similar to Windows 98, and Windows 98 looks similar to Windows 95. So you could go back in time. So if someone in the past, like in year 2001, was using Windows XP, they wouldn't have any problems using Windows 10 now. So it's very familiar in that way. So that's the good thing about it. And one of the cons about it, some of the cons about Microsoft Windows, is that it does use a lot of resources like RAM and stuff, and CPU processing power. It's not very efficient. So for the same type of performance compared to a Mac machine, you would need more RAM, because this operating system doesn't utilize RAM as efficiently as Apple macOS. And also, it's very susceptible to malware. Like, there's all types of malware, like adware, computer viruses, ransomware, adware. There's rootkit software, which affects the operating system, and a host of others, and other exploits that hackers use to take control of your system, or damage your operating system, or steal information from your computer. So it is very susceptible to malware, because since this has the largest user base of maybe, I think 88% or something. So let's look at computers and let's look at the user base. Windows market share. Okay, market share. Okay, Windows controls about 76.4% of desktop computer operating systems. Chrome 1.95%, less than 2%. OS X, I don't know what that is. Maybe that's Mac, I'm not really sure. Okay, this is worldwide. So Windows 31.6% as of 2021. iOS is, I guess that's Apple. OS X, I don't know what OS X is. Okay, that's Mac OS desktop. So this is the this is for the smartphone for Apple. That's not Linux. OS X is Apple operating system. 31.6%. So yeah. So Windows controls a larger percentage of market share, but I think this chart is dealing with everything overall, including not just desktops. It's including the smartphone, tablet, and other other platforms as well, not video games and stuff like that, not just desktop computers. For desktop, it's a lot higher. It's like 76.4% worldwide. Chrome 1.95%. Mac OS 16.77%. So for Linux, about 4.8%, which is not very good, which is very small. Has a very small market share. So since Microsoft Windows has the largest desktop user base, it is very susceptible to malware, because a lot of malicious hackers will be writing software for it, malicious software for it, to do whatever they want, like steal information, personal information, and stuff like that. So they could put like keyloggers and steal your passwords and your credit card information and stuff like that. So it does have a lot of vulnerabilities, and that's one of the bad things about the Microsoft Windows platform. And it's not as stable as Apple macOS, and it isn't as easy to use as macOS as well. So that's the thing about it. So for Apple macOS, especially for their laptops, they really run very smoothly. They don't have any problems. Not at all. So I think it has to do with the software or the operating system. For Windows-based laptops, you do have a lot of problems. They are cheaper, but they are crappier. And the reason for that is that it might be because of the operating system, and that's one of the cons about it. But definitely Microsoft Windows is more stable than Linux in terms of being a desktop operating system. So that's the thing I have to say about it. So those are the pros and cons of Microsoft Windows. And Linux, well, it's a free software. It doesn't cost you any money. You could just download it, a distro of Linux, and get it for free, and install it onto your computer, x86 or x64, doesn't matter, and it's free. And the pros of it is requires less system resources than Windows. So a lot of times I would take an old computer, which is maybe sometimes anywhere from 10 to 12 years old, and then put a distro of Linux on it and use it just to browse the internet or something, or just use it as a home server or something. And that could be done, and it doesn't really use, the way Linux works is that it's very efficient, like Unix for Mac OS. Therefore it doesn't use a lot of RAM, it doesn't use a lot of processing power and stuff like that, so it could be used for older systems. So that's a good thing about it. And you have a lot of free open source software, and the operating system itself is open source. So if you are a developer, a software developer, you could go into the source code and change it. So you could change it for different devices, like you could change it for, if you're making a video game console or something, you could use a Linux based operating system and go into the kernel of the operating system and have an interface with the hardware and everything. And you could do that with Linux, but you can't do that with Microsoft Windows or Mac OS, because these are not open sourced operating system or software. These are not open source. So that's the thing. you can't do with these two, but with this you can do that. You can change it around. You could change the operating system around so it could and create a video game console, or you could use it to create a kiosk, and you could sell that kiosk and make money and stuff like that. So you could, if you are building computers for a living, or if you do this, you could put a Linux-based operating system. It doesn't cost anything. There's no licensing fee like Microsoft Windows, and Microsoft Windows licensing fee costs anywhere from maybe $100 for Windows 10 Home to maybe up to $200 for Microsoft Windows 10 Professional. And if you want to get server software for Microsoft Windows, that could cost thousands of dollars. So this is not free. You have to pay for each licensing fee for each computer, right? And if you're using it for business, you better have the licensing key activated, or because if you get audited for any reason, your business gets audited and you're using software that isn't that have active licenses in it, you're going to get sued. You're opening yourself up for a lawsuit. So there's a lot of free software for this as well. You can, a base Linux operating system will come with Office software as well, so that you can use it for spreadsheets, word processing, or whatever. And that's a good thing about it. It just comes with it. So, and Linux is a lot less susceptible to malware than Windows because of the fact that it has a very small user base of less than 5% for desktops, and it's very customizable as well. So what I mean by customizable is you could change the way this menu looks and everything. You could change the way the file system works, the file system like this looks like, and everything. You could change the fonts and everything else. So it's very customizable. So that's one thing good about Linux. And you could change the way the entire operating system looks. You could basically make a Linux operating system look like Windows 95, exactly like Windows 95 or Windows XP or whatever, even if it is the latest version of Linux. That's one thing that's good about it. So the software itself is free. You have a lot of open source software, and if you want to add a C++ compiler on there, this is free as well. You can just get it. You can just go to terminal and type in the commands to get it. So it's it's free, 100% free. No strings attached, Another good thing about Linux is that when you update the operating system, it flushes out any malware that's in it. So for Microsoft Windows, it doesn't do that. So once you update it, it doesn't flush out everything. So this is a good thing about Linux, and it's also very secure as well. So it could be used as a server, and you'd have a very secure server. It's very stable. So what's the bad things about Linux? Well, it's not as stable as Microsoft Windows or Apple MacOS. That's one of the things you have to be prepared for when you're using Linux. If you try to use it as a desktop user, it's not the most stable software, because the incentive to making the operating system stable is money. So if these guys are making money from their operating system, they're also providing you with a service to make their operating system more stable, right? So that the user experience is good. So next time they come up with the next version of, let's say, Windows, or a next Apple computer product, that good user experience will persuade you to buy another computer or operating system from them. So there's no real incentive to make Linux stable, because these people aren't making money from it. So that's the thing about it. So it's not going to provide the best user experience for Linux. There's also lack of driver support for a lot of devices on Linux. So if you buy a new printer or something and you try to hook it up to Linux, your computer with Linux on it, it may not work, you know. The driver could be written very sloppily, and it's going to have problems, right? Or simply the hardware manufacturer didn't write a driver for Linux, you know, because this is a smaller market share, this is a larger market share, and this is and Apple OS is still larger than Linux, so you're probably going to have driver support for this Microsoft Windows or Apple macOS, but not for this. So even if you have like a graphics card in it, like GeForce RTX 3080 or something, you may have the drivers for Linux and Microsoft Windows, but I can assure you that the driver for that graphics card is going to be better for Microsoft Windows compared to Linux. It's going to be a lot better in terms of the way the graphics card performs, because they're going to spend the money on it to write better driver software for this platform than that platform, simply because there's more users here. So they're not going to spend the money and the resources to develop a good driver for Linux. So that's one of the things you got to be concerned about if you want to use Linux as your main computer. And it's very finicky too, because sometimes you may have an old printer. You could use CUP to install drivers on your Linux-based computer. However, sometimes they may not work. But for old printers, most of the times it'll work, but sometimes it doesn't work. Other times you have to play around with it to get it to work. So this is a lot more difficult than this to get stuff to work. Simple stuff. And another bad thing about Linux is that very popular commercial software may not work. So let's say a program like the speech program called Dragon. It may not work in Linux, you know. They don't have Dragon for like Apple macOS. They don't have it for Linux. It's just for Windows. So some software is only available for Windows, and a lot of popular software isn't supported on here. So that's a problem. You may have a lot of free software, but this free software might not be that good, you know. It's free, but it's not as good as this. And also you have to know commands to use Linux. Modern distros of Linux are GUI based operating system, or operating systems with graphical user interfaces. However, you still have to know how to use terminal commands. Like for Windows, this is called command prompt, right? But for on a Linux machine, it's called terminal. It's the same thing. You just type in commands to use your operating system. So you could get the most of your operating system when you use command prompt, basically. So you have to know how to use that when you're using Linux. And a lot of computer users aren't comfortable with using terminal commands, you know, because it requires you to learn commands, right? You have to know them. Like for example, in this this thing here, I'm using command prompt to go into different directories and stuff like that, right? And you have to know something to do this. You have to know the commands. to do it, and a lot of users aren't comfortable with that. So it does have a higher learning curve, and everything's not just automatic like it is in Microsoft Windows or Apple macOS. So these two operating systems, Windows 10 and macOS, they do update your operating system automatically. And in a lot of cases, you can't disable updates. It just does it, right? Whether you like it or not, they're going to do it anyway. So I guess that's good for just average users who don't know anything about computers. That's great, because you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. And these updates patch up any vulnerabilities there are to the operating system. So that's a good thing about it. For this one, you have to determine when you want to update your operating system. And you have to do that with command prompts. You have to do that in terminal commands. So that's the thing about it. So this is, I'm not saying Linux is bad operating system or anything. It is used in a lot of things. Like, I'll give you some examples. Like smart televisions have Linux-based operating systems. Your Android smartphones and tablets have Linux operating systems on it. Video game consoles have a version of Linux on it, right? It may not be like Linux Ubuntu or Linux Mint, but the people who use specialized hardware for this operating system have the source code, so they can use that source code to write their own version of Linux for the devices that you're using, right? So a lot of smart devices use Linux, so that's where its strengths are, you know. And when they are used for specific devices, they are very stable and they're good. So let's say your Sony PlayStation 4 or something, it may have a Linux-based operating system. Does it ever crash? I don't think so, right? It runs pretty stable, doesn't it? Stably. And I think the PlayStation 3 back in 2007 or 2008, you were able to install a Linux operating system on a PlayStation 3. So which gives me which I can safely assume that it had a type of operating system which was based on Linux. You could actually install Linux-based operating system on it and use it. So, but then they changed that after a couple of years and made it so that you couldn't install Linux on it. They put it in the firmware, but if you tried to install Apple macOS or Microsoft Windows 10 on a PlayStation 3, it wouldn't work at all, but for some reason this one worked. That's a good thing about it. So stuff like Raspberry Pis, which is a single board computer, has a version of Linux on it. I think it's called Debian or Raspbian on it. That's a version of Linux. So this operating system is for people who are software developers, people who want to use Linux to create something, right? Or people who really want to learn about computers. This is what Linux is for. It's not for the average user. That's the thing about it. So this does have a large market share. Just because it doesn't have a large market share on the desktop platforms doesn't mean that it doesn't have an overall large presence in other platforms, right? So let's look at the market share. So in the smartphone market, the Android phone controls about 72.48% of the market share worldwide in smartphones, and this is based on a Linux-based operating system. iOS, that's Apple, so that's 26.91. So that's just for smartphones. And you have other things like smart television, they have Linux on it, a version of Linux, video game consoles, and everything else. So Linux does have a large platform for very specialized devices. So that's the thing about it. So these are the differences between the various different operating systems. And depending on what you need, you could pick any of these three. So basically, if you want a computer that works, which is stable, provides a good user experience, this is for you. If you want to put the latest hardware in your computer, like the latest graphics card and anything else, this is for you, Microsoft Windows. If you're a tinkerer, or if you're a programmer or developer, or a computer scientist, Linux is for you. You know, a lot of the web services are basically based on the Linux operating system. And as for me personally, I do use Microsoft Windows 10 to get a lot of work done. But I also use different versions of Linux to get work done as well. So if I want to write something in programming language C, I just use this row of Linux, install the compiler on it, and use it. And very simple. It's free, and it works. And if I want to do stuff for Python, then I would use something like a Raspberry Pi and install their version of Linux on it and do some coding with Python and stuff like that. And which enables you to do a lot of stuff on it which you can't do on this platform. So this is mostly for people who want to do something with computers, like either they're developers or they're like people who really want to learn about how a computer works and how they can make money from it. And this is good for that because most of the cloud servers are Linux based. Let's see, yeah, so this is used a lot in cloud servers. You could even make your own web server with Linux. It's not very hard. You could make an email server. So you could send, if you want to do mass marketing, you could make a Linux server on just an old obsolete computer to just send emails to people. Like if you're doing marketing, you want to send 1 million emails, you could do that with a Linux server. So Linux is good for that. So it just doesn't have a big presence in the desktop market, but for other markets it does dominate. So Microsoft Windows is the king when it comes to desktop and laptop computers. And as for other platforms, Linux is the king. And Apple MacOS and iOS, they kind of they don't have as many users as either of these. So in different derivatives, this does have a lot of users, and this, like I said, controls the desktop and laptop market, and this is kind of falls behind these two in terms of user number of users. So anyways, thanks for watching my Ace 1000K.